come in with $100, $200, $500, then you go away with $250 million.
That's right.
Without any planning, without any effort. So that's what's missing. That's what's missing. And what I'm talking about in reference to the West Indian community, so-called, on Eastern Parkway, applies to the African continent, applies to Africans out of Africa, like those in Brazil, applies to us in America, who are the richest Africans since the time of the pharaohs. And we're using it on bleaching creams, and skin lightness, and chewing gum, and Pepsi Cola, and all the stuff. So we got to change that. It's change time, y'all. Obama said, yes, we can. He didn't say, yes, I can. If you saw what this little half-breed has done in trying to pursue his goal, can you imagine what we collectively could do if we declared ourselves African and then begin to put that Africanness into place? We would control our children, develop our families in an African way, an African clan structure instead of a European-American nuclear structure. So you have a built-in economic foundation if you operate around a clan structure. You have a built-in political process because you have to have a tribute to the elders, and there's a whole system of development. The young people are under your control, and when the young men and young women get to the age where they're going to have children, that's when the control becomes greatest. With us, that's when the control falls completely apart. I can't do with this girl. Send her down to the West End. Send him down to North Carolina to his father. I can't have nothing. That's when we should have the greatest control. At that stage where people are moving into, biologically, into their manhood and their womanhood. Psychologically, we don't have nothing for them, and we can't to deal with the biological process. So these are the things that we need to go beyond the camp. We need to have a manhood ceremony process, a manhood training. We need to have, when you get into your 20s, you're being prepared for some serious leadership. But you need training. You may need 10 years of some kind of training to prepare you to be able to move when you get 30 or 40 into key leadership in your world. And then when you get 60 or 70, you're supposed to chill out. You know, you're supposed to start coasting. Here's Dr. Ben still going at 90. Here's Dr. J at 72 and Mrs. Dr. J going at 70. We should be coasting. But we ain't coasting because the system ain't there to allow us to coast. We have to keep kicking until we drop dead. And then maybe from the great beyond we can spur you all to do something. We need a system. The word is we need a system. And so City University has an enormous potential because 100,000 or more of youngsters went to the City University and have a consciousness. I was on the City College radio station last night. A brother walks in. I gave him a big handshake and hug. I wasn't quite sure who it was, but it was Curtis Blow and his wife, who is now a minister. And the testimony he made that in your class, you changed my life. Your teaching changed my life. And I just gave some of that teaching to my son as we traveled down south. That happened last night. Curtis Blow. He's hip-hop man, but he's now a minister. He has a hip-hop church now. He's taking the message through the generation. He has a beautiful wife. She was there. He gave me his. I gave him the Jeffries dissertation and some of the material that Jeffries is putting together on a book, and gave him the Nubia tape, and he responded by giving me his hip-hop tape on Obama. So here is somebody, can you imagine how many thousands of Curtis Blows went through us? And if we could link them back together again, we'd have a base that could not. You don't have to convince these people. They've already been convinced. They're experiencing the life that we told them life would be. And they're trying to work off of that, trying to pass it on to their children. The brother was on, ain't nobody asked for that commercial last night when he was testifying. That's one of the greatest things that happened to me. It blew my mind. I know he was one of our students, but I didn't know he can pinpoint the time when he was transformed. And his wife said he just mentioned that again a week or so ago. In other words, it's now a part of the tradition in the family. And so I told his youngster, who does not want to deal with history, he's into math and science. So I laid out for him while we were on the radio station how he can take his teenage son or his young adult son interest in math and science and Africanize it. I said the one volume that you got to have is check1. The one image that you had to have is the image of the pyramids. And the pyramids is mathematics. It's not only mathematics in terms of monumental building, it's mathematics in terms of how you organize people for a sustained process of building over a period of 10 or 20 years. It's not only mathematics in terms of the ordinary building, it's mathematics in terms of the movement of the heavenly bodies. The pyramids are aligned with the Orion belt. Yep. So you could fascinate this youngster in history by letting him understand Diop's work and what it means. And so these are the techniques that we can use to pull our people together into a powerful force. But we have to understand and be critical of what we need. There's a young man who went through the City University system, was always at City, was taught by Dr. Clark at Hunter, and he's gone through his trials and tribulations and his rise, and then his slow period, then his rise again, and then he's tapped into his creativity, and he's a child of Brooklyn, New York, as well as a product of the City University system. And you all know him, he's a legend, because he was on Good Times as the African consciousness and the young potential African man. And so he's alive and well in Brooklyn and came out tonight to say hello to us, my brother, my son, Ralph. So he can come. Alton is worried about bringing in the high-powered Dr. Wade Nobles from the West Coast, paying airfare $600 and then the hotel, et cetera, et cetera. When we can tap into the experience of a Ralph Carter, growing up African, with the mothers and the fathers and the grandparents, and then being a child protege on a very successful program, Good Times, but then having Esther Roll, who could have been the traditional heavy-set black woman, Beulah type. But Esther was a fighter. She was a fighter. And we need to understand how she tried to bring dignity to the roles. At one particular point, they wanted to heighten JJ.
Yeah, of course.
You know, because he was the clown. But even he most likely had a serious dimension to him, but they were programming him to be the clown. They wanted to re-emphasize his role and de-emphasize John Amos's role. And my family went to school with John Amos in East Orange, New Jersey. And John Amos represented that black male, that strong pillar of our family. So you had a strong female, a strong black male, and you had a diverse family. And Ralph can talk about the politics of all that, the culture of all that, the economics of all that. He himself now is trying to put together the necessary capability of producing plays that have some meaning. And so it's important. This is a homegrown Brooklynite. We don't have to fly him in. You know, he can make it real to us. So I'll have to talk to Alton, and Sister Sarah and the rest will have to talk to Alton. We need to tap into some of our homegrown resources that are right here, and they can give us a message and help us build. Now, that's my introduction. Now, I refuse to go on without some water. Now, I ain't going to say another word without some water. I saw my wife had some water, and I see some water on this table. I refuse to go on without some water, because I intend to start flame throwing now. And so I got to watch the time, because I know you Negroes want to get home and watch Jimmy Kimmel Live, Oprah, something. It's late. It's late, Joy. It's 9:54. How long can we go? Queen Mother Ali, what'd you say?
Just go.
Okay. Let's go for another half an hour, 40 minutes. And then we will continue this on Saturday.
Okay.
Saturday is Alton's gift to you for the holidays. And there's a sister who's also a medical person, professional, and she's going to be making a presentation on malaria and how you can survive in Africa. And she'll be making a PowerPoint presentation, of course, myself and Alton. And if we can get Brother Smalls, if he's not busy, he's been away for weeks, he may not be available, but he may be able to say a few words, because the victory that I'm talking about, us pulling our resources together and making it work for us, this is an example of it. This is what Marcus Garvey wanted us to do. This is what Professor Scobie, when he got a chance to go to Egypt, he said he's still not happy. I said, why, Professor Scobie? He said, I ain't been to Africa. He meant West Africa, where we know our deep ancestry is all about. But many of you in the audience, including Leah and her mother, have been heavily involved in supporting the family that took the leadership to get a hotel in Africa. But it wasn't a hotel for sun and fun. It was a hotel that would allow us to promote a concept called pilgrimage, a sacred relationship with the African continent. And if in your culture you don't have a sacred relationship, that culture will not stick. That's why when you go to Mecca and you've got to go through that process, that's a cultural dimension that steals you forever in their tradition. And of course, in our Christian Judaic tradition, you have Jerusalem as a site of pilgrimage. All over the African continent are pilgrimage sites of our people that we need to consecrate. That's a process we need to go around and say, this site. Now, the World Heritage Group out of the UN and UNESCO has declared certain sites World Heritage. The pyramids are World Heritage. The forts and dungeons of Ghana are World Heritage. We need to redo that. And we say, yes, the pyramids may be World Heritage to y'all, but this is a sacred pilgrimage site for us. Our ancestors built this with an understanding of their relationship with the creation and the Creator, and built the greatest buildings in the history of the world. We need to go to Ethiopia. Lalibela has 12 stone churches from the ground down. We need to declare them sacred sites. We need to go to Zimbabwe and move out away from the trouble that Mugabe has been visited with the European system, making sure that this brother does not stand for revolution and struggle. And we need to go to the great Zimbabwe ruins and declare that as sacred memorial sites. And then we need to go, that's in the south, but we need to go into the north and go to the roar that thunders. The thunder of so-called Victoria Falls, one of the great wonders of natural wonders. It's a pilgrimage site. Can you imagine our ancestors coming across something like that and deciding to make it a part of their consciousness, their philosophy, their cosmology, and all the rest of it? And then in West Africa, you have all those slave forts and dungeons that are part of our world and our pilgrimage sites. And that's why we were able to get the site in Ghana, and we were so happy because it's near the university. The university is a couple of miles away. It's between Elmina, where enslavement started, and Cape Coast, where it was continued by the British. And so it's a perfect place for us to have serious study and research on reparations and what it means. But it is also a place where we can take the tradition of Nkrumah and others, and we can study nation building. A perfect example of the nation building I'm referring to is the study that I did, that if you all were serious about moving with Dr. J and moving with Attorney at War Automatics, this would be a part of everybody's library. Subnational politics in the Ivory Coast Republic. Nation building in Africa. This comes from our Seminole study, meaning we were on the ground, my wife and I, studying the Ivory Coast, living the experience. And we brought pen to paper and produced this dissertation, which was published by the University of Michigan. I never promoted it in any big way because there's an African component left out. This is a brilliant study of how you build a nation But how you sustain it and make it work for you has not been included. The leaders of Ivory Coast, led by Houphouët-Boigny, in a 20 or 30 year period became an economic miracle. How did it happen? They understood economics was the first principle of the universe. Politics is the complementary principle. They put together an economic, political dynamic of planning to control development that produced an economy that went past Ghana, Nigeria, and everybody else. Was on the world stage competing with Brazil, which is 10 to 15 times larger than Ivory Coast. How did that happen? We need to study it. Well, you can't study that neo-colonialist. He was a flunky for the French. Well, if he was a flunky for the French and he produced what he produced, we need to study him. Because there's a whole lot of people that ain't flunkies for the French or the British, and they're very important, significant nationalists and Pan-Africanists, revolutionary, and they ain't produced nothing. Like Dr. Clark said, they can't even produce a toothpick or a handkerchief.
Yeah.
So we need to study our people. Don't use ideology to prevent us from looking past them. We're going to have an example to see this at work on Sunday, 3 to 6. It's got to be on African time because Dr. James McIntosh is controlling it. That's the great debate. And the great debate ain't going to happen. Who is that?
Dr. Jeffries.
Yes.
There's a correction on the date. There's been a change of venue.
It will be the beginning of a great debate process. It's so constricted, there's so many of us, there's no time for debate. We've been given 8 to 10 minutes. As you see, I haven't even gotten into my lecture tonight. So you know there's no way in hell that Viola Plummer and Len Jeffries and James Turner can be fitted into an 8 to 10 formula. However, the process is something we need. We need to bring together our people who had great experience, who have great minds, who have great consciousness, and they need to be connected with each other so they can start to put together the plans that we need. The blueprint for Pan-Africanism that Brother Amos showed us could be done. He did it in terms of the African-American experience. Blueprint for Black Power. But we're talking about a global community that needs to have a blueprint. And so, and there's no better place than Brooklyn for it to happen because there's so many Africans from all over the African world here in Brooklyn. It has passed Harlem a long time ago in terms of its significance and its importance. So Friday will be at the Langston Hughes Library in Queens. On what avenue? I don't know. Astoria?
Northern Boulevard.
What is it?
Northern Boulevard, 100.
Northern Boulevard.
10th Street, I think.
What is he going to bring in? Reverend Sharpton to run his economic plan? You know, you take the people, the fools who put together this system and caused it to fall on its face, and you tell them fix it. It's your system, you fix it. But we still have to have an African plan.
Yes.
And the most important part of the African plan, and just let me finish the Friday at Langston Hughes, Saturday at City College, and Sunday at Salem. And if it's still 3 to 6 and we can't do what we need to do, we may be able to go up to the City College to Clark House. We were there last Sunday and we stayed to about 9 or 10 o'clock. So we may be able to do that this Sunday. I don't think they have any activity. In other words, James McIntosh said they had to leave out of that church, St. Mary's, by 6. And that was one of the reasons why everything was so collapsed into this 3-hour period. But all of these people have always done the impossible, and we will continue to do the impossible. Let me just run through and give you what a Jeffries course would be, and I'll continue this on Saturday. This is the Educational Power Pack, which has a lot of information that we use in our classes. For one thing, we use the pyramids to reclaim our history. There's a concept that we always talk about, and that concept is whoever controls the images controls the self-esteem, the self-respect, and the self-development. And our people are caught up in arrested development now because someone else controls our images. What Brother Alton is saying is we need a critical thinking process where we can define things for ourselves, just like when we were dealing with the beginning process that our sister was taking care of, and we were wondering what African nation was first independent and what was colonized and what was conquered. Alton would say the first thing that you can do before you get into any conflict is clarify the definitions and agree on the definitions. So we need to take the statement and then look at it critically and then logically break it down, and then we can talk about where do we go. So that this process is what Alton is laying out for us and will help us get out of some of the dilemmas we get in not having clarity on definitions, etc. What I'm talking about, if a neo-colonialist could produce what the Ivory Coast was when we were studying it, you can imagine what a Pan-Africanist could do. And his neo-colonialism, having had a special relationship with the French, was enhanced because he knew that he couldn't pull off a system capability in the Ivory Coast without an African cultural formula which is manifested in this image. This is what? I've showed you this image many times. Who knows what this is?
Those are the pharaohs they found here after what, 2,000 years, 3,000 years?
2,700 years,
3,000.
these pharaohs were buried. They were taken from the holy mount, Jebel Barka. This is another sacred place.
Yeah.
They were taken from the holy mount, Jebel Barka, in Sudan,
National Geographic.
and broken up and taken about 100 or 200 miles further toward Egypt, north, and buried at Kerma. And 2,700 years ago, they were buried, and they came up out of the ground 2003. The young man Taharka, he was telling his father, Pianki, who started the conquest of Egypt, to restore it, to cleanse it, to purge it of foreign elements and materialism, and return it to spirituality. Taharka was telling his father, well, when are we going to make, or he said to his uncle, Shabaka, when are we going to make our move? We've been here for 2,700 years. Ain't it time for us to hit the big time again? And then the father said, I think it's time. I'm working on a docudrama on this now. And the father said, rumor is that Dr. Jeffries, Nana Kwekujua Ajiman II of the Gogo Stool in Ashanti, is going to be coming by here in a few months. And it might be time to get our asses up out of here, because if he comes to here, he'll definitely take our story and raise it up for the world. And so 2003, they brought their asses up out of there. All 7 of them that had been broken up, and the archaeologist, the Swiss who's been digging there for 30 years, he was able to put them back together again. And in 2004, a few months later, Dr. J is there with Brother Taki, visiting the sacred places in Nubia. And sure enough, Dr. J has brought it to the world. It's on the internet now, on YouTube, etc. So I don't mind bringing out all this important information for you, because I know it's going to nourish you. The greatest story for me in the history of the world is this particular story. 50-year turning point of history that gave Africa another 1,000 years of glory. But it's not in the history books. The conquest of the cities of Kemet, Egypt, by the Nubians is one of the greatest stories that has ever happened. And it ain't in the history books. Taharqa, who's on the cover of the National Geographic article, is the only pharaoh who's actually mentioned by name in the Bible. I think in Kings and Samuel's or something like that, he's mentioned because his armies kept back the Assyrians from conquering Jerusalem. But the story of these brothers is our story. Just as the sister, Reverend Pastor Aminatu, who I met at Reverend Dillon's program a couple of weeks ago, and she said, it's not about Obama mania, it's about Obamaology. We need to study him. We need to study this story. The conquest of city after city by the Nubians. And this is the first image in the article. After you get the image of Taharqa, then you have the image of African armies in conquest. They don't want us to have the image of black folk with guns or weaponry.
That's true.
This is an image that went around the world, and some of you all were saying, well, I don't know whether I can accept this as white folks' interpretation. Interpretation of what? They got you shooting your flaming arrows and conquering the cities of Egypt. And the land to the south was called Ta-Seti, land of the bow. And these armies were part of Kemet's armies. A contingent of Nubians along with a contingent of Kemites you'd see as part of their armies of conquest. But this is a story 800 BC, 750 BC, before anyone in Europe could read or write, before the Greeks had writings, before there was the myths and legends of Homer and the Odyssey and the Iliad. You had a real Odyssey and Iliad in life, Africans conquering city after city, and it is written down. And why did they conquer? They conquered in order to restore. And this is the Africans restoring the greatness that was. Behind them is the Holy Mount. And around the Holy Mount is 7 to 8 or 9 temples. The great Amun temple to the male godness comes out from the mount. And the great female temple to the female godness, the Hathor temple, goes into the mountain. The female private part goes in, the male private part comes out. They actually took the human anatomy and put a spiritual dimension to it and linked it to the creation and the creator. And when the royal babies are birthed, they're birthed inside the womb of the mountain to give them a divine process to begin life with. And then they're brought out to the community. So this leadership process lasted for hundreds of years. We have a leadership process that doesn't go past one generation. So we're not doing something right. And our people laid it down. And what was inspiring them? This is 750 BC. 750 BC to 700 BC can be considered one of the great turning points of history. I have this concept of the 50-year turning points of history. And this is one in ancient history. And life, as I mentioned Saturday, is change, transformation, and rebirth. Restoration, resurrection. That's what life is. Every living thing, the cells of your body, the organs of your body, the systems of your body have to go through change, transformation, and rebirth, and it's constant every second of existence. The ecology is change, transformation, and rebirth. The cosmos is change, transformation, and rebirth. Obama didn't invent change, he's just tapped into it. Your ancestors understood that, and that's why they built the pyramids. To represent change, the human change, and the transformation into another life. and then a rebirth spiritually in another dimension. The temples were built to train for you to appreciate and understand change, transformation, and rebirth and resurrection. You didn't just go to the temples to pray. You didn't just go to temples to sing and shout. You didn't go to the temples to just have rituals and ceremonies. You went to the temple to affirm that you are consistently changing in the right way, change, transformation, and rebirthing into a greater spiritual formation. And when we can institute this, we can change our lives. Our people are hit and miss in doing it. Harriet Tubman understood there's change, transformation, and rebirth. And she said, I'm getting up out of here. And she's escaped from enslavement. But then her sacred mission hit her. She could have stopped just freeing herself, and she's one of the greatest figures in human history. But sacred mission says you have an obligation. This type of a love, this agape love, this family love that my wife was talking about, meant that she had to risk her life going back again into slavery, not one or two times, but again and again and again and again and again and again and again, taking hundreds of our people out of enslavement with a weapon at her side that if a Negro did not want freedom, he was going to have death.
Right.
That's a model that all of our children should have.
You don't have to be.
You got an image of a Harriet Tubman, but you haven't translated what she represents. She is a role model because she freed herself. She's a mind model because she knew that she had not a formal education, but she had the mother's wit to outwit the slavers and the slave catchers and the hound dogs, and to even outwit stupid Negroes.
Yeah.
So she's a role model and a mind model. But this, again, this pyramidal process, which I want you to use, change, transformation, and rebirth, role model, yes, we need. Mind model, yes, we must have. But she became a spirit model. She moved into a realm beyond herself, tapping into the creator and the creation to produce an image so powerful that it stands today. Even though we haven't properly translated, even though any other culture that had a Harriet Tubman in their life would have made her a saint.
Right.
And we can't get her name on a street right out in front of us.
Yeah.
Any culture that had a Harriet Tubman. Europeans have a Joan of Arc.
Yeah.
She was killed by the stupidity of the European because they couldn't handle the power of a woman. Right. Saying that she did what she did. She wanted to change and transformed herself into a warrior, and she was about the beating of the English to save France. And she did that because she had a spiritual mission. She had a sacred mission. But the existing institution said, you had a what? You a women had a what? Would you tell this to a council of the bishops and the archbishops and the head of the Catholic Church? Yeah. And she was stupid enough to tell them that what she did in terms of change, transformation, becoming a warrior queen and saving her people, she did because she was inspired by God, and they said, burn her ass at the stake.
That's what they did.
And she was burned at the stake.
You know, many of the French believe that she escaped.
Is that right? Now she didn't. No.
Well, that would be affirming what I'm saying. Some people in France had sense enough to make her a hero to speak to them today. Every one of us, every one of our children should have a Harriet Tubman as a hero.
Yes.
And then you have our partner, and that would be the Frederick Douglasses and my great-grandfathers and a host of your people. Every great person should have a Malcolm X as a hero. And so what I have done to make this history, because I'm talking about the total historical reconstruction, I'll lay it out a little more on Saturday. A total historical reconstruction is what Black Studies is all about. It's not getting a few courses to get a degree. It's about the transformation of the personality. It's about empowering. And so in order to deal with this whole sweep of history that we have to master, I have what I call the 3 50-year turning points of history. And if you can get into the material that we handed out, we can quickly deal with some of those 3 turning points. The first thing you have is the mother of us all was what? African. How do we know? Study. A scientific study was conducted. And that scientific study established that all of the scientific information and data, the scientific truth points to all of us in the human family coming from Africa. Do you know what it took for the New York Post to publish that in September '91, when in the same issues they were beating me up as some imbecile and some fool? And I had already established the victory of us in this intellectual warfare, and the victory is this, and take note of it. The victory is what I call African primacy. Not African superiority, not African domination, but African primacy. Using the pyramid shape of the Great Pyramids of Giza. At one polarity, you have what I call the origin of humankind. In our traditional learning processes coming from the European, we learn about the biblical traditions. The Garden of Eden, Adam. Not Adam and Eve, just Adam, playing by himself in the garden. And then one rib was plucked, and Eve. The African original story, the origin story, a myth and a legend, a wisdom knowledge, just like the Christian and Judeo-Islamic stories. Wisdom knowledge. The African story, based more on scientific understanding, has the Creator creating two pairs, two sisters, two brothers, and then having them marry. More scientific than having Adam and Eve and a snake talking shit in the garden. But the African story to teach includes that these two pairs went through the human misunderstanding, and jealousy and envy emerged, and the two brothers got into conflict. And so the brotherhood failed and led to the death of one brother, the murder of one brother. That's the African wisdom knowledge, saying that if you allow jealousy and envy to come in between you and that agape love, that family love that you're supposed to have, then the end result may be devastating. That's a story that speaks to eternity. The Africans symbolized it by putting it in the Tekken symbol that's before all of the great temples. But that's a concept that speaks to you for eternity. And so we've got to understand how serious are these approaches. Now, when I want to deal with these concepts like I've just mentioned in terms of the Tekken, open up to pyramid analysis. That's the second page. And to complete what I just started in terms of the victory, which is African primacy, you have African origin at one polarity. At the other polarity is African evolution. And on the summit is African cradle of civilization. That's the victory. That's our story. That's the human story. And there's nobody's story that can stand up to it. The African origin goes back millions of years, not 6,000 years, millions of years based upon the fossil finds. That African evolution goes back 200,000 years, at least. That's the DNA studies by Dr. Diop and others that were brought out in his great work, Civilization and Barbarism. African cradle of civilization, 10,000 years ago, the Sahara began to dry up. People began to move out of the fertile Sahara into the fertile Nile. And then the other river valleys of the world were affected by this climate change. And so you had people moving into the Tigris Euphrates in Western Asia, in Southern Asia, into the Indus Valley, in India, into the Yellow River Valley and Yangtze Rivers in China, and into the lakes and rivers of Central and South America. So all around the world, the Sun Belt, you had these cradles of civilization. There's nothing European in origin. There's nothing European in evolution. There's nothing European in the cradles of civilization. That's the victory. Once you have that as your foundation, you can redo the history of the world. And that's what our responsibility is all about. But we need to use the pyramidal formula. And here we have thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Going to the top of the pyramid and synthesizing knowledge. And in order to make that knowledge real and understand it, I have a concept of caps. Going to the top of the pyramid, and you go to the capstone. Caps. All knowledge should be looked at in terms of concepts, analyses, processes, and systems. And then I added later a VIP. For the European, it's a very important person. For the African, it's African values, African interests, African principles. When we ask ourselves those 7 keys, we can get into a critical analysis of what our circumstances are or the issue that we're dealing with, and we can begin to do the critical thinking that's necessary for us to move in a serious way. There are two value systems that dominate the world. In this pyramid analysis, you have the upright pyramid, which is an ascendancy principle to godliness, centered around spirituality, and a value system that's communal, cooperative, and collective. That produces harmony and balance and working together, and produces a general movement forward in terms of development. On the other side, you have the European model, which is the upside down, the imbalanced pyramid. And in that pyramid, you have at its center profit by any means necessary, materialism. And you are dealing with the concept of domination, destruction, and death. All cultures have both processes, the ascendancy process and the descendancy process. All cultures have growth and development and destruction. The Africans developed the science of how spiritualism can dominate materialism and produce a sustained developmental process for thousands of years. Africans developed the concept of the science of spirit dominating material. The greatest material structures in the world are the pyramids, but it is also the greatest spiritual structures in the world. It was built for spiritual purposes, not for the material grandeur of an individual. It was built for the communal, cooperative, and collective spiritual understanding and consciousness of a people. The symbol of the obelisk is a symbol of the schools of knowledge that African peoples translate down through the generations in order to sustain a culture. The Washington Monument was copied by the European. And so you have the stolen legacy of the Washington Monument, which is the worship of an individual, the worship of materialism. It is the largest of its kind. That's not the African tradition. The African tradition produced these symbols to represent spirituality, the complementarity of the male and the female principle, the necessity for the male principle to successfully learn to live with a brother, otherwise decay and destruction follows. So in front of the great temples are the symbol of the Tekken, and they represent schools of knowledge, creation stories, how you learn to live together, how you develop the success of a sisterhood. That symbol of the male genital, of the male phalanx. The deep thought is the ability of the female to generate life. The deep thought is the built-in sisterhood of the women because they have this dimension of producing children and nurturing children. And so in the African tradition, the women naturally bond, naturally have ability to raise children, to raise somebody else beside themselves. Men have this problem of learning how to bond and learning how to avoid jealousy and envy and conflict so death results. So the failed brotherhood and the successful sisterhood is what that symbol tells us. It means our mission is to make sure that the brotherhood is successful. And out of that tradition of death comes the life of a new spirit, and that's Heru, who is the child born out of the death process, a sacred birth. And so this new symbol of the resurrection out of death of the new generation is what Heru represents. And later times it became the Jesus story of resurrection and rebirth. But in the African tradition they have a similar story of someone who resurrected and who saved and regenerated power and ideas. And these are the things that we need to understand. There's a Heru in the tradition thousands of years before there's a Jesus and a Muhammad.
That's right.
So you have to have a timeline when you look at the history. And so that's what we try to do. 3 50-year turning points of history help us deal with change, transformation, and rebirth. The one 50-year turning point that I always focus on is Queen T era. That's 1408 BC to 1353 BC. That's when her son was handed the leadership of the Nile, and he went into a deep change, transformation, and rebirth, following the pattern of his father, building the great temple at Waset, where you can have an institution to change and transform and rebirth people into a consciousness that we are spirit and we are connected. The Great Pillared Temple, built by Queen T's husband, that Great Pillared Temple is the greatest building of the ancient world. All brotherhoods, Masons, everything else, Rosicrucians, take their lead from this particular process, this temple that this sister and her husband built. She was with him for 38 years while he was putting in place these institutions where you train yourself. Leaders may be born with the potential for leadership, but they have to be formed. Your African foundation has to have a complementary African formation. That's why we are stumbling and bumbling around so much, because we failed to put in place an African formation. The miracle of the Ivory Coast is that the brother mastered the European, but he did not become European, knew how to use Europeans. But in order to make his country a success, he came up with an African formation to create leadership, to organize leadership, and it was a society of secrets. Under the banner of the Rosicrucian, he had a society of secrets, a leadership group that was formed to come together spiritually to map out the plans and the destiny of the society. And that group could be 50 people, 100 people, 500, or 1,000, depending upon the issue. They used the Rosicrucian movement, inspired by Akhenaten, who's the light of the world for the Rosicrucian movement. Queen T's son, that's why the date 1400 represents Queen T and her husband moving to power in the Nile. And then you have her son, the Pharaoh Akhenaten, marrying Nefertiti. And then he went through this fantastic process of change. They call it the Amarna Revolution. But it was rapid change, rapid transformation, rapid rebirth. Too much materialism was in the culture in Thebes, the city of 100 gates, Waset. And so with the pollution of the great Nile Valley civilization because of the conquest out of the Nile and the bringing in the booty, this brother had a spiritual awakening that we need to change and transform and get back to our basic spirituality. So he left the richest city of the world and went out into the desert and built a new city of God. Change, transformation, and rebirth. A new image of what God wrought. His beautiful wife Nefertiti and him would be seen affectionately holding each other and caressing each other. There would be scenes of the royal family with their daughters on their laps. Images, control, self-esteem, self-respect, and self-development. He was trying to move the country into a heavy developmental process with a new spiritual center. So we have to look at these things. We can't wait for the Europeans to tell us what these things are all about, but you have to have an understanding of your culture in order to be able to make sense for you. Ivory Coast produced a great economic, and he had a wager with Nkrumah. He says, you go your way, I'll go mine, and we'll see who gets there first. These were two brothers competing with each other, next door neighbors. And Nkrumah went his way, which had a formation that was not African. And Nkrumah was African. He had the African foundation, but the Nkrumah formation was Marxist. And when he put together his sacred institution for training leadership, it was the Winneba Institute, which was directed by Eastern Europeans, Marxists. And Nkrumah was not putting in place the Pan-African that he spouted. Now, I put this out there. It's a heavy, heavy understanding that we got to have. That some of our people can't go all the way to Africa. We have that going on now. Many of the people in our religious traditions can't go to Africa, and our Muslim traditions can't go to Africa. They can't cut away the formation that was put in place that is basically anti-African. We got to look at it all and say, if we're really going to go where we need to go, we got to be African. First and foremost, and then we can relate all the rest of it. If you're a Muslim first. If you're a Catholic first. If you're Protestant, you're Protestant. You're born again Christian, you're born. If we want to produce an African world, we got to be Africans first, unapologetically. So that's where we're going. Enough is being put at us. This success of this brother is not by happenstance, just like these people coming up out of the ground saying, we are giving you an example of what you achieved. We were inspired to reclaim the great legacy of the Nile, and we conquered it and linked it with Nubia. What inspired us was the generations that went before us. What inspired us was Mentuhotep, the pyramid builders. When we came, after we saw what was in Giza and Egypt, we went back to Nubia and we started building pyramids even greater than before. There are more pyramids in Nubia than in Egypt itself. There are more pyramids to the queens and larger pyramids to the queens than for the men. So you have this whole process of the Africans working out the relationship between the male power and the female power and their spiritual power and their ruling power and their control over economics. And so Taharqa and his people were inspired to renew the culture because they had the examples before them of the pharaoh Zoser, who had the great Imhotep build what? The step pyramid of Saqqara. And that step pyramid of Saqqara went through what? Life. And life is what? Change, transformation, and rebirth. And so eventually the step pyramid, which would be layers of what they called mastaba, the layers of mastaba then became the true pyramid. And that was 100 or 200 years later, developed in the period of Khufu, Khafra, Menkaure, 3 generations of African greatness. And so this is the old kingdom. So what the Nubians were doing was reflecting back 2,000 years to the old kingdom and getting inspired. Then when Taharqa came back from Giza, he said, the little pyramid that I'm building that might be 100 feet tall, I got to build another one over that. So he was inspired to build another pyramid, but more than that, he was inspired to restore the great temples of learning. The sacred mount is the abode of God, the southern abode of God. And the Africans created a northern abode of God out of their own hands. The southern abode of God comes out of nature, the concept of the primal waters of Nun, the mind of Ptah. And so, but in Egypt, they built a reference to Amun that was built by human hands. The great temple, Karnak temple complex, where each person coming to power affirmed that Amun God process. You have to understand our people did wonders, y'all. And here, all of that has been kept from us. This is before any Greeks, the Europeans was in the caves. Jay, what are you talking about? Yes, they was in the caves. Their culture is cave culture.
Yes, it is. Right.
You know, when they wanted culture, they came out of the caves. And so you had the old kingdom of Great Pyramid building. Then you had the new kingdom of the great intellectual development, the papyri that have been written, the written mathematical papyrus, Ephesus papyrus, the Moscow papyrus, the Berlin papyrus, the Milan papyrus. All these papyrus are named after cities where they took African knowledge and put it in their museums. But this is the founder of the Middle Kingdom. The founder of the Old Kingdom, Zoser and the rest of them, obviously Africans, Menes and all the rest of them. This is the founder of the New Kingdom, a Middle Kingdom, raising anew the greatness of Africa. And when Taharqa and these others came up, they were inspired by what they had done, and so they renewed the great works and the great temples of these brothers. Now, that's the founder, but this brother here is my favorite because he is such a hard, I think I've shown you many times, but I need to put him in context. And this is Amenemhet, or Amenemhet the third, 12th dynasty. Mentuhotep is 11th dynasty. This brother, you ain't gonna get no more African than this. How can white folks claim him? If I saw the sucker coming across Fulton Street, I'd have to run up to Atlantic Avenue at night. This dude looks bad.
Dark-skinned white man.
But his blood ran through the Nile for the next 200 years. Do you see why we have to claim our space and our place? It's all there. These images were put together by Asa Haggard. And so I've taken them around the world. Everywhere I go, they go to Rio when I go to Rio. They go to Jamaica when I go to Jamaica. I always make sure I got them. When I went to Jamaica, I gave a 5-hour lecture. They couldn't stop me. In fact, the sisters said at 1 o'clock, they said, Dr. Jeffries, we want to stay, but it's 1 o'clock and we got to get prepared for tomorrow. That's when you're really supposed to speak. This was just a reception. But see, I did a calculation. I said at the reception was going to be the bigwigs, the people that got some clout. So that's why I brought my weaponry. And once we got started after some good food, I couldn't stop until after 1 o'clock. But luckily, the next day, Saturday, I looked at that crowd in the theater of hundreds of people, particularly young people. I said, I got to go to work again. And so I went for 3.5 hours. And it changed people's lives. It changed people's lives. This word changed people's lives. Just like Curtis Blow said, just your classes changed my life. Now, Asa, this was his favorite. This was a mummy priestess with her curly black hair and clearly Africanesque. Asa loved the women. And my wife and I know why. Because he came out of a sacred womb. Asa's mother was sanctified and Holy Ghost and everything else, and she lived to be 95. So this brother had this strong female component to him, because, you know, in order for you to be you, you got to be male and female. Yeah. Your mother throws in 23.
Who was that woman you just showed us?
This one, I'll have to get the real name. It says Anut Tawi, High Priestess, 18th Dynasty, New Kingdom. You see? And these are the images that we need to have to help us clarify this. But clarify what I've been trying to say. And what I'm trying to say, in order for us to appreciate the sweep of history, we need techniques. So I came up with the 50-year turning points of history. There's a Nubian 50-year turning point. And it referenced back to the New Kingdom turning point. That's Queen T, 700 years before. And Queen T referenced back 700 years before her, 2100 BC. That's the Middle Kingdom. And then the Middle Kingdom referenced back 700 years before that. That's the Old Kingdom. And then you have 700 years after that, you have the Nubian finds they found at Kustel. So now you're going back to 30-something hundred BC. African economics, African politics, African culture, cementing a people growing in the consciousness of the Creator. We call by the various names of God. This is what we have to see, brothers and sisters. We didn't survive enslavement when we were supposed to be not human, to be around here prostituting ourselves, taking our wealth and buying every piece of garbage that we have. We have a mission of change, transformation, and rebirth. It has been said by Minister Farrakhan and others, there's a reason for us to be taken out of Africa hundreds of years ago and put in the belly of this beast. So we know this beast better than anybody else, because we've been at it, in the middle of it. And it is possible for us to take what we've learned out of this experience, re-Africanize ourselves, and bring that consciousness and that power to the African continent to birth it again. Africans on the continent can't do it. They've been subject to the same process of arrested development that we have. You can't get a Bishop Tutu to do it. No. Bishop Tutu said he wanted a, what did they call that?
Truth and reconciliation.
Truth and reconciliation. That the people who raped your mama could say that they did it and explain how they did it and not even say they're sorry.
Yeah.
You sorry, and you sorry enough to let them know. At least a few of these crackers should have been killed. Yeah. Eon Smith should have been hung from a high tree in the middle of Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe. And his 10,000 acres of land should have been taken back symbolically as reparations that Africans need. Right. Africans somehow need to have a clearing of their minds. They're so in love with this white person. Yeah. Nelson Mandela is a great historical figure. But he don't want you to raise reparations. No. What? No. Well, no. But see the formation. Nelson has an African foundation. He was birthed part of the royalty of his people. He had an African formation. In other words, he was getting schooled, but then the school was controlled by the Europeans when he further went up into the schooling. So he became a lawyer. Once you become a lawyer, you're not fit to fight for black people. You're processed to serve the system. And so Nelson still fought, and he looked for a way to fight, and he saw not an African way, not a Zulu warrior way or a Xhosa way. He saw a Marxist way. That Marxism came into our world in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s and misdirected our people to this day. I'll be talking about it on Saturday. All of our great movements have been turned away, our revolutionary movements, because of this Marxism, which was anti-African at its base. Marx and Lenin felt that Africans weren't even a part of history. There's no revolutions that could have come out of history. That's why Diep, who was a Marxist-Leninist, spent second part of his book dealing with the revolutions that occurred in African civilization to put a new spin on Marxist-Leninist ideology. These are the deep things that we need to go into, brothers and sisters. We can't deal with it now, but I want to leave you with this. The 350-year turning points of history. A good part of the material I gave you deals with the European turning point of history. That's Christopher Columbus. The African turning point of history renewed our great civilization. And then all of a sudden, the Europeans come out of nowhere. 1482, they established Elmina, west coast of Africa. 1492, they bump into the New World. 1493, there's so many discoveries, they go to the Pope and they say, Pope, give us some guidance. Pope said, what's your problem? We don't know who controls what. Spain has traveled around the world planting the flag. Portugal traveled around the world planting the flag. And so make a decision. So the Pope, in his wisdom, with his spiritual consciousness, drew a line from the North Pole to the South Pole, gave half of it to Spain and half of it to Portugal. We're still dealing with that division of the world by these insane Europeans, blessed by their God, even to this day. And that's the things we have to change. So in order to be able to look at what happened in the 50-year turning point of history, 1482 to 1536, where all of the isms that we know of came about, racism, imperialism, colonialism, white nationalism, fundamental capitalism, agricultural capitalism, commercial capitalism, all of those things emerge in that 50-year point of history, genocidism, from 1482 to 1536 AD, and I call that the Columbus era. A good part of the material that I passed out to you deals with that, and I'll go over it on Saturday. Now, that Columbus 50-year turning point of history kicked in control of economics, control of politics, control of culture. Globally, through the slave trade system. And with that control of economics, politics, and culture through the slave trade system, the Europeans were able to establish a system that has sustained itself for the last 500 years. So there's no need for us to think that an Obama can come into a system that has sustained itself, has regenerated itself, has transformed itself over 500 years, that Obama is going to make the change. What he has done for me is to create a psychic confusion of the Europeans. The Sean Hannitys, the Bluss Blimblows, and the rest of these fools don't know what the hell happened. We thought we had the American century. It didn't even last 1,000 days, much less 1,100 years. And so they're trying to figure out what happened. Now, when the masters of the plantation are in disarray, and their system has collapsed, that's when the enslaved folks make a run for it. That's when they make a run for it. And so we as enslaved folks need to make a run for it. Have serious plans for building our world. Now, you can't say it hasn't happened. It is happening as we speak.